Stangibelisco here. I'd just like to offer my take on some characteristics of geekiness versus nerdiness. And that'll maybe help you decide if if you think you're either one of these two things, which applies to you more. I don't think there's ever anybody who's exclusively a geek or exclusively a nerd. There are plenty of people who are neither a geek nor a nerd, and there are a few people who might be a geek nerd or a nerd geek. What would you call that, a neek or a gerd? More or less equally divided. But here's some characteristics that, in my opinion, differentiate geeks from nerds. First of all, geeks tend to be worldly smart. Bill Gates is an excellent example of a geek. Worldly smart people can become quite wealthy because they have worldly savviness, or they know just how to operate in the real world, whereas a nerd is more what you might call one of these people who is bookly smart. Might have an IQ of 175, but when it comes to figuring out how to get a member of the opposite sex to go out with you, forget it. It's a little more difficult. The geek is into computers, whereas a nerd is more likely to be into science and math. We might call a geek an extrovert, whereas a nerd is more likely to be what you would call an introvert. Outgoing versus keeps to themselves. A geek is more what you might associate with software, like a programmer, for example, whereas a nerd is something that you might more likely associate with hardware. Somebody who designs the power supply for a personal computer, for example, or who designs the display for a personal computer, sits there and works with nuts and bolts, whereas a geek is more into the programming aspect of computers. That's as it applies to computers particularly. A geek is more likely to be an actor, whereas a nerd is somebody who writes the movie that the actor stars in. Again, the geek is a heck of a lot more likely to get wealthy than the nerd. But a screenwriter gets paid pretty good. If you go out to LA, there's some people that make pretty good money doing that, but they're able to do it in the privacy of their own home a lot of times, whereas as an actor, there's just no way that you're going to do that in the privacy of your own home unless you're a nerd like me. And I do think I classify myself much more as a nerd than a geek. I'm just not into software at all. But hardware, most definitely, yes. When it comes to something like the radio, a geek is more likely to be a radio personality, such as a DJ, whereas a nerd is more likely to be a radio amateur. Like me, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. Finally, and I think this may very well be radio personity. Okay, a radio personity. I'll just leave it like that. That's a new word. That's not bad. I don't think it means exactly the same thing as personality, but hey, you can't have everything, can you? So, that's one thing that happens to me when I write, when I try to write and do videos. Oftentimes I screw up my words. My brain gets ahead of my mouth, or is maybe sometimes my mouth gets ahead of my brain. That's what happened here. My mouth and my pen got ahead of my brain. Okay, but finally, I think you might say that a geek is a digital being. All ones and zeros. Whereas a nerd is more of an analog being. Continuously variable, infinitely many values, much more difficult to analyze and process, whereas the geek specializes in analysis and processing. So that is my take on this, and you can call me full of baloney, and wouldn't be the first time. But that is, now, what do you think? Where do you fall in this spectrum? Maybe we could make a continuum going from 10 over here, 10G, to 10N over here, and then 0. Well, I don't think you'd call a person a 0 just because they're equally nerdy and geeky, but where do you fall on this particular scale? I would put myself at about a 7 right here. A 7N. Stan Gibilisco signing off from the Nerd Castle penthouse. It sounds a lot better. Geek Castle just doesn't cut it. Geek Cave, that just doesn't cut it either. But Nerd Cave, Nerd Castle, and all that kind of stuff. Nerdmobile. Well, Geekmobile ain't bad either, but my vehicle, big number 8, is definitely a Nerdmobile. So that's my self-analysis, but I'm more interested in letting you go ahead and analyze yourself. Everybody likes to analyze themselves, don't they? It's just they don't much care for other people to analyze them. I know I really hate that. Stan Gibilisco signing off. Till next time. So long.